Extract from the 714th Contact Report of Tuesday, January 1, 2019, translated with DeepL.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. Source:
Zeitzeichen
119 on page 1 to 8.
Because I'm wondering what happened to the growth craziness last year. Your investigations cover the individual human being still born at the last moment until midnight on 31 December.
Our investigations in this regard are extremely precise, since I can name the number of 109,723,416 earthlings, the last night, on December 31, 2018 at 00:00 hours, were shown on our recorders, whereby exactly at 23 o'clock, 59 minutes and 56 seconds near Campo Grande in the area of Mato Grosso do Sul, the natives had their last birth in 2018. Thus the Earth humanity has increased in total to 8,953, 851, 416 respectively to 8,953,851,416 Earth humans.
Happy. Contrary to the lies of the world population counters, nearly 9 billion Earthlings now populate the planet, while the wrongly counting world population counter brings it straight to 7.7 billion, while, if it continues within the same framework as before, in the year 2028 or in a further 9 years, the Earth already has 10 billion people to carry and feed. This, while the scientists who deal with human growth falsely claim, according to the World Population Clock, that now just under 7.7 billion people would populate the Earth. And the nonsense, according to which mankind would only amount to about 11 billion and 200 million Earthlings in the year 2100, is a conscious lie and a malicious misguidance unparalleled in relation to humanity on Earth, whereby it is prevented by all means that a worldwide ban on births for several years and a worldwide birth control are introduced in order to drastically reduce the overpopulation. If one considers that already nearly 9 billion Earthlings populate the globe, which must be supplied with food, that this overpopulation however still grows inexorably further and will need ever more food and innumerable further various need articles, then it is obvious for each reasonable human being, which sad end everything will take. The effective fact is that every single person who is born anew and needs various products to exist and live, pushes all existing problems even higher in every respect. But this does not concern the irresponsible governments of all countries, because by their cowardice and irrationality, and because they want to keep their well-rewarded offices and posts, they shy away from informing their populations in this regard that a birth stop and birth control is of absolute necessity if all evils and destructions of every sage are to be stopped. But this bar is a very long way off, because nothing is effectively done at all, but the opposite is the case. Earth humanity continues to be misled with lies, false statistics and fraud, especially the young people, who are taking to the streets more and more to demonstrate against climate change, which is effectively a destruction of the climate. Neither the young people nor the entire world population itself are told or explained what the real origin and source of the whole climate master is, namely the inexorably growing overpopulation and all the machinations that result from it, which are becoming increasingly degenerate in terms of the destruction of the climate, nature, fauna and flora. It is also kept quiet about the fact that not only the CO2 and with it the enormously increasing tonnages of toxic exhaust gases of automobiles, working machines of all kinds, trucks, motorcycles, ships, airplanes, motorsport vehicles, military vehicles, battle tanks, fighter planes and explosive materials, as well as the innumerable motorsport vehicles etc. destroy the climate more and more, but also the innumerable chimney stacks etc., by which more and more greenhouse gases are promoted. But there are also countless other causes that produce emissions and contribute to climate destruction, especially the many toxic substances that poison the entire environment through agriculture, small and large nurseries, industrial food cultivation and private horticulture as fertilizers. In this regard, toxic substances in particular should be mentioned, such as herbicides, pesticides, fungicides and insecticides, such as DEP, rodenticides, neonicotinoids, Bordeaux broth, glyphosate, copper lime broth, methyl mercury, growth regulators, seed dressing agents and anti-crash agents, etc. The very bad DDT, which was used by the Americans in the last World War as protection against malaria and which is deposited in the environment and even accumulates to a large extent in the natural food, was banned in various Western industrial countries from around 1970. As far as I know, since 2004 this poison may only be used worldwide for disease control. But this does not make things any better, because this very dangerous poison corresponds to a chemical that is extremely difficult to degrade, which spreads over very wide areas of land and water and poisons everything, but which also enters the body of humans via vegetable food, water and respiratory air, as well as all other forms of life, accumulating in the fatty tissue and causing suffering. Also the bee mortality and the environmental pollution are denounced nowadays particularly by young people and adult environmental conscious ones publicly by demonstrations. However, also in this connection no useful reaction develops with all world responsible persons, as also in this regard no information is brought in relation to the fact that also here also the whole evil is founded in the overpopulation and in their destructive machinations. This also applies to the long-lasting progression of destruction and the increasing extinction of biodiversity, whereby the entire bird, mammal, animal, insect, amphibian and reptile worlds are also extremely endangered, and some are already extinct or close to extinction. All the catastrophic machinations that exist, increase and are driven forward by the overpopulation result in relation to the growing world population, which is very diverse and also so catastrophic because they are linked to the destruction of nature and fauna and flora, and thus also to the eradication and destruction of biodiversity and biological diversity. But not enough, because the fauna is also connected with it, which suffers tremendous damage. So with regard to the extermination of animals, birds, bees and insects, due to the intensified and poisonous agriculture, various birds have lost their breeding places, such as skylarks etc., but also animals such as deer, whose fawns are normally stored in the high grass, but which are too often cut away, whereby the young animals are often killed by mowing machines. The populations of all honeybees and wild bees have also been endangered for a long time because all fruit trees and flowering plants are sprayed with toxic substances and the bees are poisoned as a result, as is the case with all kinds of insects, some of which are already well over 70% practically extinct. And when I name for example living beings, like the arthropods and hexapods, as well as the rock jumpers and fishes, the flying insects are on the verge of extinction. The Kerbal Kerf and other species richest class of the arthropods and at the same time in relation to its absolute majority the species richest class of all organisms at all, with what in the tropical rainforests and in all areas of the earth still millions of undiscovered types live, whose original emergence on the Earth took place more than 470 million years ago for the first time, as Sfirth explained. To my knowledge, as I learned from Sfirth, there are so many millions of insect genera and species on Earth that about 75% of all wildlife forms are insects, but they are increasingly endangered by poison spattering and many of them are driven to extinction. And this happens by machinations, which emerge as consequence from the overpopulation, because by their gigantic food need the whole variety of all biological and or vegetable food can only be planted, drawn and brought to the growth as well as to the harvest and into the trade, by being sprayed with health-damaging, suffering and disease-causing and even deadly poisons, which accumulate in the plants, for humans. And the only reason this poisonous spattering happens is because only the extermination of insects, which have been naturally infesting food plants since primeval times, can no longer interfere with the enormous giant and mass production of plant food production. The fact that many vital insects and all sorts of other living creatures are killed and exterminated in the process is of no concern to the poisoner companies, the farmers or nurseries, nor to the private and hobby gardeners or the large vegetable food cultivation groups, and all this happens by criminal and irresponsible as well as unscrupulous machinations, which emerge as inevitable consequence of the food procurement from the enormous mass overpopulation, exactly in order to nourish the 9 billion terrestrial humanity, whereby however ever more at country is destroyed and also very many vital organisms of all kinds and kinds are killed and exterminated. The millions of tons of toxins produced annually by poisonous corporations worldwide by farmers, garden centers and large industrial food plant producers for the protection and prosperity of vegetarian food and nature are hardly comprehensible. But this corresponds to an overpopulation makeup, by which not only nature is destroyed slowly but surely in its entirety and all life of the fauna and flora is impaired more and more exterminatingly and destructively, but also the whole mankind, which feeds on all the produced vegetable food products. Just as fauna and flora are poisoned by toxins and become diseased or die from them, and are subject to destruction and extinction, that is both plant and fauna forms of life, so too is the whole of mankind on Earth in general. All vegetarian foods absorb and are poisoned and then eaten by people, while the irresponsible producers of poisons, chemists, poison companies, health authorities, etc., lie and deceive conscientiously and irresponsibly, claim that a minimum amount of a few milligrams or micrograms of toxins is harmless and harmless to human health. The effective fact is, however, that the smallest amount, be it just 1 milligram, mg, equals 1/1000th of a gram equals 10 to 3 grams, or 1 microgram, micrograms, equals 1/1,000,000th of a gram equals 10 to 6 grams, affects health. And in fact, 1 nanogram, ng, or 1/100000th of a gram is enough to cause any suffering or serious illness, with various types of cancer being the most common, the worst and therefore the deadliest. But neither the chemists, who invent all the various poisons, nor the corporations, who produce all the poisons, nor those, who greed for money and profit, use and dispense the poisons in order to gain enormous harvests and thus accumulate horrendous financial assets. The fact and truth is that everything is happening to keep humanity alive and also to be able to provide food for its countless descendants who continue to be born unreasonably into the world, in addition to everything else that is needed by the masses of every population of every country. But this is not said to the naive young people demonstrating for a better climate and to the populations of all states at all. because they remain stupid and ignorant and basically do not understand what they are demonstrating for at all. What must also be said is the fact that, with the current world population, it must be thoroughly considered that, in order to feed it, a gigantic area is already needed, which, as you have very precisely calculated, corresponds to a planting area of around 20 million square kilometers, that is, as much as all of South America, Ukraine and Spain together have in square kilometers. And this 20 million square kilometers of land, of course distributed all over the world in relation to soils that can still be planted for natural food and are still naturally fertile, or that only produce food plants contaminated with toxins through malignant, toxic chemistry, through which many people suffer from cancer and other ailments, can only be calculated for the earthly overpopulation. In addition, according to your calculations, there is an enormous floor area of around 31 million square kilometers, which is about the size of the whole of Africa and Germany, whereby this huge area is used exclusively for planting animal food, that is for animals of various species, which are then slaughtered and their meat is processed into human food, the skins into leather, the bones into fertilizer, etc., and the intestines into meat meal, etc. The animals are then processed into meat and bone meal. That together makes up around 51 million square kilometers, which are needed to feed the world's nearly 9 billion people today. Various states, especially China, have been outsourcing their food production and other products for human consumption to other countries for decades and leasing or buying their land and land because there is no land available in their own states where food can still be cultivated and harvested or where animals can still be used for meat production, etc. The reason for this is that the countries of the world have no land of their own. And to these states belong, in addition to other European states, also Germany, Holland and Switzerland, which in this way use the soils of foreign countries and thus drastically choke off their own possibilities for vegetable food cultivation etc. and also poison the landscapes and their streams and other waters as well as the atmosphere. As a result, the indigenous populations themselves suffer because they can no longer grow their own vegetable food. But this means that many of the natives of such countries are starving and many of them are dying of hunger, whereas there are currently about 900 million people worldwide who do not have enough food and are closer to death than to life. If they want to live, then they must either live from rich foreign states or from those who lease or buy their land and land for their own food production, plant and rob, buy the necessary food dearly, if they have the necessary financial means at all, but which is usually not the case. Consequently only the way to the grave remains open to them, precisely by starving. What has so far been made clear by what has been said, even if only in an incomplete way, because much more could be said about it, are other disastrous machinations to be mentioned, which emerge as malicious and destructive consequences from the inexorably growing overpopulation. Thus it must be seen and understood that every year not only tens of millions of new offspring are conceived and born without any thought, as in 2018 more than 109 million, but that every year also about 100 million young people reach adulthood and begin to act as such. That means that these, at least a large part of them, take the right to which they are entitled and motorize themselves without thought, even with a motorcycle or car. That is probably undeniable. On the one hand, this increases the exhaust gases and CO2 content worldwide by enormous tonnages from these explosion motor vehicles. On the other hand, the atmosphere and thus also human health, as well as the entire natural environment and its fauna and flora, are endangered and impaired to the point of destruction, death, destruction and extermination. However, the exhaust fumes from explosion motor vehicles are only a part of the entire emission disaster, because this lurks in many other things, which hardly any human being worries about, for example with regard to the food that every earthling needs. The fact is that the production and processing of food also causes enormous tonnages of CO2, as well as other toxins that are harmful to health, but which are never mentioned by the scientific community, and everything is concealed in this regard. And all these poison emissions are released into the atmosphere as well as through rain and snow into the soil and thus back into the plant food, in which the poisons also settle and are then eaten by humans. When emitting greenhouse gases, we must not only think of the traffic with explosion motor vehicles, such as cars, buses, motorcycles, ships and airplanes, etc., because the production and manufacture of food for earthly mankind must also be included effectively, which also produces huge quantities of greenhouse gases. Also the production of feed for feeding all the bred huge masses of animals, fish, poultry and other animals, etc. which are kept, slaughtered and produced for the human meat need food, are partly responsible for the greenhouse effect. And the food for the earthly mankind contributes even more and more to the fact that the greenhouse effect is constantly increasing more enormously with every new earthling that is born and drives up the overpopulation. So not only the endless columns of smoking cars, motorcycles, tractors, trucks, airplanes, ships, diesel trains and other explosive motor vehicles, but also chimneys of human dwellings, power stations and factories and many other exhaust gas centrifuges are to be mentioned as causes of the greenhouse effect. And if that is considered, then it includes, and this must be said fairly, every juicy fruit, every berry, every grain and every vegetable, regardless of whether it is produced in a distant country or in one's own homeland. I will now continue to say that, if I remember correctly the recent teaching, vegetables, berries and fruits, like all other vegetable foods, also become CO2 spin-downs if they are consumed outside the production and harvest times. And that is because their CO2 values change in an increasing way due to transport and storage, on the one hand, but also due to transport from the storage depots to the final sellers, on the other hand. Then comes the further CO2 increase through the transport of the food into the buyer's home, as more greenhouse gases develop during the preparation of the food, so that more and more of these gases are produced than is the case with the mere consumption of fresh vegetables. A further matter is to be addressed, which refers to vegetarianism and veganism, whereby stupid stalkers weakly and nonsensically insult the people who eat only vegetable food as herbivores, herb murderers and the like, as these on the other hand also idiotically insult the carnivores as animal murderers etc. It is a fact that some live their vegetarianism and veganism and others their omnivorous form, as it has been given since primeval times by the human form of life. Unfortunately, however, the people of the earth are mistakenly addicted to a belief as a result of false doctrines, lies, conspiracy theories, false information and false views, etc. Fanatical beliefs of a religious magnanimous nature, and believe in their imagination that man alone should consume vegetable food and the like and should not kill animals and therefore also not eat meat. And this happens because of their lack of knowledge, they cannot understand the natural creative law and its effective naturalness, which is precisely related to the fact that man is an omnivore. There is a lot to be said about this, which means that I have to digress a bit from the actual topic and also make it clear that I am not taking sides for the omnivores or meat eaters, nor for the vegetarians and vegans, but simply explain what I am effectively making clear in accordance with the rules with regard to reality and its only truth. The omnivorous food and thus also the meat meal, as well as the vegetarian and vegan food, correspond to the different forms of life, which exist in the free nature as well as in the area of human life, like for example pigs, dogs and many other living beings of all genera and species. Unfortunately, vegans, vegetarians and omnivores do not really want or understand that they are subject to an unrealistic delusion, because they are not able to perceive the reality and its truth through some flimsy, intimidated imaginations etc. and consequently are not able to comprehend it. Many of them have wrong views and opinions due to religiously sectarian misleading suggestions, while others are not allowed to eat meat or vegetable products due to intolerance or illness. Others, however, for indefinable reasons, have a reluctance to eat any vegetarian or meat food, or they defend themselves against the consumption of such food for reasons unknown to them. Vegetarianism, like veganism, is usually based on incorrect assessments of the laws of nature, as well as on stupid and dishonest new religious claims made by fanatical delusions of God, which they reinterpret by reinterpreting the Bible and other books. And this is precisely how the greatest lies, deceptions and conspiracy theories emerge, because in modern times, falsifiers and conspiracy theorists falsify and reinterpret the stupidities that mislead and drive mad the earthlings in the Christian Bible and in other religious books. And so it also happens with reference to the Bible verse of Genesis 9:3, which is supposed to have been said by none other than God himself, which of course is absolute nonsense, but which is supposed to be called, but it may also happen as a result of false love for animals, etc., as well as because it is lied that a God has forbidden eating meat, as in modern times, for example, is falsely claimed by the lying and distorting biblical falsifications. Every Christian knows this idiotic Bible verse and he explains to everyone why people are allowed to eat meat and animal products. In the beginning, the relationship between God, man and animals should have been harmonious and in harmony with each other, and life in paradise should have been full of peace, as the Bible suggests for its believers. Furthermore, the imaginary God in Genesis 1:29-30 is said to have also said to the people, "For food I give you the seeds of the plants and the fruits that grow on the trees all over the earth. But to the land animals and the birds and everything that creeps on the ground, to all creatures that carry the breath of life within them, I assign grasses and leaves for food." And if the Bible is considered further, then also the announcer Emmanuel, who is slanderously called Jesus, Christ and the Son of God by the delusional believers, taught other things than a crazy prohibition of eating meat. He was neither the Son of God nor a vegetarian nor vegan. However, in addition to tremendous lies, this also correctly distinguishes the Bible that he ate fish according to Luke 24:42-43 and lamb according to Luke 22:8-15. Emmanuel also distributed fish and bread during the feeding of the alleged group, in which in reality and truth only a few dozen people were present and therefore not 5,000 earthlings. Effectively only about 250 people were present at this Sermon on the Mount and the multiplication of fish and bread, and only a few men were present, contrary to the assertion of lies in John chap. 6, verse 10 in the New Testament. It was mainly only women and children who listened to Emmanuel's explanations and followed him, who in reality was only a small hill. So the 5 barley loaves and the 2 fish that Emmanuel had increased through his powers of consciousness were used for only about 250 people women and children as well as for 40 men. but not for their 5,000. Effectively, it would have been extremely strange if Chmanuel had been a vegetarian or vegan. Also, in a vision of the Apostle Peter, it is explained in the New Testament that Chmanuel had declared all food pure, including the flesh of the animals, as can be looked up in Acts 10:10-15. Even after the great flood at the time of Noah, the alleged God Creator gave people permission to eat meat, as God never abolished this permission in Genesis 9:2-3. Of course, these are only fables, but in this respect they are the oldest in the Christian world. But in modern times they are falsified by sectarian and fanatical liars and conspirators, and are suggested to the delusional believers, who believe all the nonsense and fall into its trap without thought. And this has been the case since time immemorial, also with regard to the vegetarianism and veganism of the Essenes, who were not early Christians, but a religious group in ancient Judaism, while Christians have lied from time immemorial that they were early Christians and that these first Christians were vegetarians because God wanted that animals should never be slaughtered and eaten. But these are nothing other than fables, lies and fantasies of earthlings who have fallen prey to a delusion of God, because on the one hand there has never been a creator God, there is none and will never be one. Because since the very beginning only the creation universal consciousness was given as pure spiritual energy, also exists today in this way and will exist until the end of its time, until it changes and enters the next higher level, as this is described in my explanations. Well, why humans kill animals, which they then eat as food, was the same from the very beginning of their first human existence. Because in a completely natural way the primitive humans were already hungry and had to feed themselves, consequently they did the obvious and invented the hunt for animals etc., hunted them, killed them and ate their flesh. And since there were neither religions, sects, cults nor delusions of God in primeval times, no cock cried out that early humans consumed meat. Only as delusions in relation to one, and thus deities and religions were imagined, whereby in particular Christianity then came with the 10 Commandments, especially with the 5th commandment, in the case of Christianity, which then produced and continues to produce particularly strange murderous blossoms. Vegetarianism and veganism also emerged, based on completely false and crazy delusions and delusional misunderstandings, which continue to exist delusionally to this day. And these delusions in relation to the fact that a creator God, who in any case is always of an imaginary nature, has forbidden the killing of animals for food purposes and the eating of their flesh. This corresponds not only to a conspiracy theory, but also to a delusional deception unparalleled in relation to those who believe in the delusion of God, as well as to absolute nonsense and lies and deception.
It wasn't only the church holidays that were effective, as for example.
With all religions and sects it was the priests who, in addition to their delusions of God hypocrisy, also killed animals as butchers and gutted them on the altar with a knife, and then burned a certain part of it on the altar, while the rest of the meat was roasted and eaten. As a rule the priests received the remaining and larger part, while a smaller third part was given to the one who paid or donated the sacrificial animal and gave it to the priest for slaughter. But what today the delusional believers in God or the religiously sectarian delusional believers of the earth are doing with the old word of the Hebrews, which has been abysmally falsified by Christians, and which they declare falsified as the 5th commandment of the Bible as the will of God, probably surpasses the worst ever invented deceptions, falsifications, lies and deceptions. Moreover, the whole of transformed reality and truth leads to the rampant delusions and dishonest and deceptive consequences that cause hardship and misery and millions of starvation deaths in the world, by lying that men should not kill animals and not eat their flesh. For the people of the earth, meat is a natural and evenly natural food, whereby the breeding of animals and fowl as well as poultry etc. and thus the keeping of all forms of life, which are to serve humans as food, are, however, to be cared for and treated cleanly, justly, correctly and as living beings worth living. But this also applies to the entire plant world, because all of these belonging genera and species are living beings, which is why they also need the honor and dignity that must be shown to them. But now, in relation to the world of life forms that live in the wild or that are kept for slaughter for human food, no form of cruelty to animals, no raw mistreatment, no letting go of hunger or thirst, etc. of animals, poultry and all other life forms of all genera and species should be permitted. All forms of life are, in the same way as the human being, integrated into life and consequently all become weaker with increasing age physically, but also psychically and consciously, or instinctively and instinctively, and die sometime. But for all forms of life, human beings, animals and poultry, insects, fish, amphibians and reptiles, etc., as well as all other living beings of all genera and species, life requires that they all have their own food, be it vegetable or carnal, because only by having all their own food, which is specifically intended for them, can it be prevented that an entire species does not die out after some time. Regardless of whether for humans, animals, gems or plants, it is always, absolutely and inevitably necessary that their offspring or their offspring is classified after birth, the new becoming and sprouting etc., and thus both physically grows up and becomes adult. According to the natural laws, it is inevitable that through experience as well as through the conscious world of thought one learns and gains knowledge, as is the case with humans. This, while functioning instincts develop in animals, poultry and animals, etc., as well as effective feelings and psychic impulses develop from the instincts. This is particularly the case with mammals of all genera and species, as well as with various animals and other life forms, just as with humans, which are all affected by weak to strongest and deepest psychic impulses and can be moved to tears by joy, grief and pain as well as humans. As a consequence, it is also part of the whole that in addition to the food appropriate to the life forms, the offspring must also be considered, because only if they can maintain their lives and also provide for the necessary offspring, their genus and species will be preserved. With the humans, many animals and many genera etc. living offspring is brought to the world, while other organisms lay eggs. It must also be said that in the plant world by contact with insects and birds, etc. or by the wind, to reproduce, etc., the plants are not able to reproduce. Pollen from seed plants is dusted and other plants are also dusted and thus fertilized and stimulated to continue etc. However, no matter how the reproduction may look in detail, according to the laws of nature, all life forms of each species and species need their own food and reproductive possibilities in their own special way, on the one hand in order to preserve and live their own lives, and on the other hand in order to guarantee the survival of their own species through offspring. It is also important that living beings, from humans to all animals, all creatures, millions of insects, all poultry, amphibians, fish, birds and reptiles, etc., inherit their vital characteristics through their genes, genetics to their offspring. Figures 8 Seichen, near 119, June/1 2019 8, which is also the reason why many species can be assigned to certain genera. The human being, as well as certain higher animal life forms, also has characteristics such as intelligence, but also possibly a higher world of instincts, etc., which also depends on the genes.
To be continued.
Democracy.
Democracy means that the people determine in unity the welfare of the state and the population, but what is actually understood, handled and exercised as democracy by the people and by those in power is a form of politics that is ominously and hostile to the welfare of the powerful and a very stupid majority of the people. SSSC Hinterschmidrüti, June 23, 2005, 2.27 hours, Billy.